All right, so welcome to the screencast that is a short introduction to something called common pool resources. Well, what are common pool resources? Well, before we get to what common pool resources are, we first need to talk about two different properties that goods often have, all right? So the first property of the good is something called rivalness, all right? So rivalness is the extent to which the consumption of a good reduces the amount of the good that's left to be consumed. All right. So the best way to think of this is with a concrete example. A sandwich is a perfectly rival good. Every bite I take of that sandwich reduces the amount of that sandwich that is left to be enjoyed or consumed by other people. All right. You can think of something different, like maybe a fireworks show. Well, my consumption of that fireworks show doesn't really reduce how much of the fireworks show is left for others to consume. All right, my eyeballs taking in those photons doesn't stop someone else's eyeballs from taking in those photons. All right, so in that way, a fireworks show is not a rival good, or not rival in consumption, which is the way we sometimes say it. Also, this property of goods is also sometimes called subtractability of a good. The idea is a little more literal. Does consuming the good subtract away from the amount of the good that's available? So it's a little more picturesque way of thinking about rivalness, and you'll see it in the textbook used this way also, is that the good is subtractable or not subtractable. All right. The last way that people talk about the rivalness of a good is whether or not the good is what's called a collective consumption good, and it means the same thing. It means does consumption by one consumer reduce the consumption of other consumers? All right. Another way we think about it is that the marginal, for a good that is a collective consumption good, the marginal cost of providing more of the good is zero. All right. So once I'm putting on the fireworks show, it doesn't really cost me all that much for one additional person to watch the fireworks show. In fact, that marginal cost of one additional viewer of the fireworks show is zero for the most part. All right. So those are three different ways we talk about the rivalness of a good: subtractability, rivalness, and whether or not it's a collective consumption good, meaning that for additional people to consume the good, once the good's provided, additional people consuming it doesn't really cost any more. All right. So you can think of a giant public park. All right. Once the park is provided, for the most part, unless it's a big festival or a busy day, one additional person enjoying the park doesn't really take away from others enjoying the park. Another example that's listed here on the slide is a radio broadcast signal. Once the radio broadcast signal is provided, you tuning in with your radio doesn't really take away from other people's ability to tune in to that radio broadcast. All right. The other property that we need to talk about before we get back to common pool resources is the excludability of a good. All right. So excludability means that once a good is provided, how hard or easy is it to legally keep others from consuming it? All right. So think back to the sandwich example I used earlier. If it's my sandwich, I can legally prevent others from consuming that sandwich. I can exclude others from consuming it. Again, with the fireworks show, once you provide the fireworks show, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to keep other people from enjoying and consuming that fireworks show. It is not excludable or non-excludable. Once a non-excludable good is produced, it's difficult to keep people from consuming it. An example is national defense. Once national defense is provided, anyone who wants to enjoy that national defense gets to enjoy it. In fact, it's almost the flip side of non-excludable. It's almost non-voluntary. You get national defense whether you like it or not. All right. So I want to take these two properties of goods, how rival or non-rival the good is, and I want to put them on a two-dimensional axis. Okay. So a good can be excludable, meaning it's easy to keep other people from consuming or enjoying that good, and it can be non-excludable. And of course, there's all these different possibilities in between. There's a continuum that goods have between being excludable and being non-excludable. How easy is it to prevent people from consuming the good if you have the legal property right to that good? Okay. The other property that we talked about is the rivalness of the good. So a good can be strictly rival, meaning if I consume some of it, it's gone completely. And it can range all the way to being non-rival, meaning that my consumption of the good doesn't take away from other people's consumption in the least. All right. And in between, there are goods where maybe like roads, small roads, where my driving on the road, well, sometimes it doesn't take away from other people driving on the road. But when the road is really congested, each additional person does take away from the amount of good to be consumed. So roads maybe are somewhere toward the middle. So in this class, we're going to talk about the different zones of this graph, of this space. So some goods are going to fall down here. They're going to be more towards excludable and rival. Some goods are going to be up here where they're mostly non-excludable and non-rival. Some goods are going to be here where they're rival. If you use them, they're gone, but they're going to be non-excludable. And then there are going to be goods down here that are excludable, but once you allow people in, they're also non-rival in consumption. All right, so we're going to talk about these 4 zones of this property space, for lack of a better way of saying it. All right, so here I'm going to bring in, and I'm just going to label each of these areas. So goods that tend to be excludable and rival tend to be private goods. In fact, a good that is perfectly excludable and perfectly rival is what is called a pure private good. All right, a pure private good. On the flip side, goods that are non-rival and non-excludable are public goods. And a good up here that is perfectly non-rival and perfectly excludable is what is called a pure public good. All right, and then down here, goods that are excludable, yet they are not rival in consumption, are called club goods. So you can think of like a pay-per-view television or something like that. And then goods up here that are non-excludable, yet the consumption of them takes away from the whole, are called common pool resources. So that's why we needed to get all this vocabulary before we talked about common pool resources, all right? Because that's going to be what we talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit, we've already talked a good bit about private goods. In fact, most of your econ classes deal with private goods, goods that are excludable and rival. Let me address, why do I have these zones and why are they overlapping? Because it's not a hard, fast rule where a good goes from being excludable to not excludable or rival to non-rival. It's a continuum. So that's why I don't have these zones as being where the boundaries between these zones is hard and fast. All right. So now we're going to talk about public goods actually later on and somewhat club goods in later on. But for now, we're going to talk about common pool resources. All right. So common pool resources are rival and non-excludable. Once the resource is used, it's gone, and it's very hard to stop people from using the resource once it's provided or once it's out there. All right. What are some examples of common pool resources? Well, fisheries are common pool resources. Forests are common pool resources. Minerals, to a degree, are common pool resources. Irrigation districts that different farmers share. Groundwater basins are definitely common pool resources. And clean, unpolluted air are all common pool resources. Well, what happens with common pool resources? All right. So with a common pool resource, the incentive is to take as much as you can as fast as you can. All right. There's always what economists call a unilateral incentive to defect. Unilateral meaning you always have an incentive individually to defect on the group and get as much of the resource as possible. You may come together and agree, hey, why don't you fish today? I'll fish tomorrow. But you always have an incentive to go and get as much as you can as fast as you can. All right. Because it's not excludable. You can't keep people out from using it. And once it's gone, it's gone. All right. This idea of the quick use of a resource is called the tragedy of the commons, attributed to Garrett Hardin. All right. So the story that Hardin used to talk about the tragedy of the commons was a pasture near a village. In a lot of places in Europe, for a time, they had these common grazing lands where everyone could bring their sheep or whatever it is to graze in the common grazing lands. All right. So every shepherd or cattle herder in the community takes their animals there to graze. Access to the pasture is free and unrestricted. All right. Well, what happens? Well, as you can imagine, what happens is that everyone tries to raise as large a herd as possible. All right. everyone in the village lets their large herds go and graze freely on the pasture. In fact, they compete to try to get there earlier and earlier in the day so that their herd has more time to graze on the land. Well, eventually, if you don't let the grass have time to grow back, there's not going to be any vegetation left at the pasture, and all your cattle are going to start to starve or die. All right, so that was what Hardin called the tragedy of the commons. What are some of the solutions? Well, you could try to regulate access to the pasture, or you could raise taxes for its upkeep. All right, you could, there it is, the bullet point. Or you could auction off grazing rights to the highest bidder. All right, you could say whoever pays the most gets the right to graze on the land. You could split the pasture up into small plots. All right, and you could sell them. All of these are different ways of trying to solve the excludability problem with the common pool resource. All right. All these goods make the good excludable, but you can't always do that. What about the Atlantic cod that we already mentioned? How do I make fishing for Atlantic cod excludable? Well, it's very, very difficult to do that sort of thing. All right, so you can't always do that sort of thing. All right, so this ends the screencast, giving you an introduction to common pool resources. I'll see you next time.